Texas, summer 1944. The air shimmered with heat above the cotton fields, cicadas droning in the distance. A weathered John Deere tractor idled near a windmill, its engine coughing rhythmically. Standing beside it, in a faded khaki work shirt marked PW in black paint, a young German prisoner hesitated. He had once driven half-tracks through France. Now, he stared at a green farm machine under the wide American sky. Free of guards, free of barbed wire, only the quiet eyes of a farmer watching from the porch. "Go on," the man had said earlier, his drawl patient, almost kind. "You know how to drive, don't you?" The German nodded slowly. He climbed onto the seat, boots dusty, hands trembling against the hot metal. When he pressed the starter, the engine came alive. Smooth, powerful, honest. He felt the vibration through his palms, a sensation he hadn't known since before the war. As the tractor rolled forward, the farmer smiled and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, there were no enemies here, only two men and a field that needed plowing. When the first German prisoners arrived in Texas in the summer of 1943, the war in Europe had shifted. The Africa Corps, once Rommel's proud desert army, had fallen. Thousands of captured soldiers, engineers, and sailors filled temporary enclosures in North Africa. Too many for the British to house alone. The United States, bound by the Geneva Convention of 1929, offered space. Ships that had once carried munitions to Europe returned loaded with prisoners. Quiet, thin, sunburned men staring through the portholes at the approaching American coast. By the end of 1944, more than 400,000 German POWs would be scattered across the United States. Texas alone would host nearly 80,000 of them, spread across camps in Hearne, Mexia, Hereford, Huntsville, and dozens of smaller branch sites that dotted the countryside. To the local farmers, it was surreal. Many had sent their sons to Europe to fight these same men. Now, those enemies were unloading trucks of grain, repairing fences, or clearing fields a few miles from their homes. The reason was practical. America's young men were overseas. Crops were dying in the fields. Texas, with its vast cotton and wheat lands, faced a desperate labor shortage. The War Department needed hands, and the POWs, under international law, could be put to work in non-military tasks. Each man would be paid a small daily wage, 80 cents in canteen coupons, credited to their accounts, but rarely spent. The work was meant to occupy them, to keep them from restlessness or despair. For the farmers, it meant harvests could continue, barns could be repaired, and food could reach the soldiers abroad. But something unexpected happened. The POWs, many of them educated, polite, and grateful for decent treatment, worked hard. They saluted guards, followed orders, and often sang while they labored. The Texans, who had been wary at first, began to see them less as villains and more as young men caught in a storm. One farmer in central Texas recalled, "They were cleaner and more disciplined than most of the boys I hired before the war. They worked like they wanted to prove something." By the fall of 1943, military trucks carrying POWs became a familiar sight on backcountry roads. Wooden benches filled with men in mismatched uniforms, their helmets replaced with straw hats, their laughter mingling with the wind. At first, they were always guarded. A single armed soldier rode along, rifle across his knees. But soon, something unusual began to happen. The guards relaxed. The prisoners didn't try to escape. They waved to children on porches, smiled at women driving to town, and learned bits of English from the farmers' wives who handed them lemonade at midday. The Americans had expected suspicion. What they found instead was mutual curiosity. The Germans, raised on wartime propaganda that painted Americans as decadent or cruel, were stunned by what they saw. Orderly farms, clean houses, and ordinary people treating them with civility. One prisoner later wrote, "We could not understand it. We were enemies, Yet they trusted us with tools, even with tractors. They looked at us not as soldiers, but as men. That trust was more than courtesy. It was policy, rooted in the Geneva Convention's requirement that POWs be treated humanely. The U.S. Army saw such treatment as proof of moral superiority over the Axis. Every act of kindness was a quiet message to the world. This is how democracy behaves, even toward its foes. And in the warm fields of Texas, far from the ruined cities of Europe, that philosophy took an unexpected form, a kind of everyday peace. It began with small gestures, a shared meal, a cold drink, a handshake after a day's work, but soon it would extend further, into something no one had planned. Friendship. The kind of friendship that could make a German prisoner forget, even for an afternoon, that he was a captive at all. Behind the barbed wire, the days were ordered by the bugle. Reveille sounded at dawn. Prisoners lined up for roll call in crisp formations. Habits drilled into them long before capture. The sun rose over the plains, casting long shadows across the neat rows of barracks built from pine boards and tar paper. Each camp was designed like a small town, with its own mess halls, infirmary, canteen, chapel, and recreation yard. At Camp Hearn, one of the largest in Texas, the Germans called it Klein Deutschland, Little Germany. They planted gardens, built small theaters, and even printed newsletters in their native language. U.S. officers, following the strict guidelines of the Geneva Convention, allowed them to organize camp committees. There were elected leaders, choir rehearsals, art exhibits, and academic lectures. Some camps even offered classes through the University of Texas Extension Service, teaching English, mathematics, and American history. In a strange way, captivity became civilization in miniature. But beneath that order was a quiet tension, not between guards and prisoners, but among the Germans themselves. The camps contained a mix of men, seasoned veterans of the Wehrmacht, young conscripts, and a smaller but vocal minority of die-hard Nazis. The hardliners tried to enforce discipline, often intimidating those who expressed gratitude toward their American hosts. In the early months, secret honor courts punished prisoners accused of defeatism. A few were beaten or even murdered for showing disloyalty to Hitler. The U.S. Army responded by segregating the camps, separating the ideological fanatics from the moderates. In Texas, this created an unusual atmosphere. The majority of the men, freed from political fear, began to relax. For the first time, many questioned what they had fought for. Letters home spoke of disbelief, that Americans were not starving, not oppressed, not the caricatures they had been taught to hate. Instead, they saw a land of plenty, where even prisoners ate meat, drank coffee, and received medical care better than some German civilians back home. One diary entry found after the war read, "We are treated like men, not beasts. I cannot hate them anymore." This humane treatment was not mere generosity. It was strategy. Colonel William R. Davis, a camp commandant, once said, "Every man we treat fairly is a man who will speak the truth when he goes home." Washington understood the psychological value of kindness. A former enemy, treated with dignity, might one day become an ally. Meanwhile, outside the wire, the rural economy flourished. Texas farmers submitted formal requests to borrow prisoner labor through the War Manpower Commission. The process was bureaucratic, but efficient. The Army transported work crews to and from farms, with guards ensuring discipline, but the system evolved faster than the rules. Guards soon noticed that the men didn't run. There was nowhere to go. The desert and open fields stretched endlessly. A few escape attempts were made in the early months, mostly by young idealists, but all were quickly abandoned or peacefully surrendered. By late 1944, many camps allowed the prisoners to work with minimal supervision. Farmers would drive them to the fields, watch them start their chores, and then leave to run errands, returning hours later to find the Germans still working diligently. Trust grew in quiet increments. A shared cigarette, a conversation through broken English, a handshake at sunset. That trust would reach its symbolic peak in places like Hereford, where POWs organized their own orchestras, or at Mexia, where they played soccer matches against local high school teams. It was here, amid this unlikely goodwill, that the next chapter unfolded, when the boundaries of captivity blurred completely. Because one day, a farmer tossed a set of tractor keys to a German prisoner and said, "Go on, you know how to handle her." And to the shock of everyone, especially the prisoner, he did. The story of the Texas POWs is not one of defiance, but of rediscovery. For the Germans, the first shock was not punishment, but respect. When they were captured, many expected humiliation. Instead, they found hot meals, medical care, and clean barracks. The realization that their captors followed rules, and even smiled, broke something inside them. Farm work became therapy. In the beginning, they labored silently, mechanically, bending over cotton rows, stacking hay, cleaning irrigation ditches. But under the blazing Texan sun, conversations began. English phrases mixed with broken German, jokes emerged. Laughter carried over the wind. For the farmers, too, something shifted. They had seen these men only through newsreels and headlines, as faceless soldiers who had bombed London or invaded France. Now, they were young men sweating in the same soil, waving to children, sometimes even singing folk songs as they worked. Children would bring them lemonade. Housewives left sandwiches at the field gates. And on Sundays, some prisoners were quietly invited to church picnics, unofficially, but with the unspoken consent of local officers who saw no harm in it. By 1945, several newspapers published cautious reports describing how Texas farmers were impressed by the work ethic of their German laborers. What wasn't printed, but widely known, was that many of these men had been allowed to handle farm machinery, often unsupervised. It wasn't charity, it was necessity, and trust earned through discipline. The decision to deploy POWs into agricultural work was rooted in military pragmatism. The U.S. faced a severe labor shortage, with over 11 million Americans in uniform and vast tracts of farmland left untended. Food production risked collapse. The War Department's solution was both bold and efficient. Let the prisoners work under Geneva Convention rules. For every hour a POW labored, the government credited him a token wage, paid not in cash, but in camp coupons redeemable at the canteen. This arrangement saved millions of dollars and stabilized crop yields across the South and Midwest. Texas, with its sprawling ranches and mild winters, became one of the primary hubs for this human reserve. The results were astonishing. Within months, POW work units harvested thousands of acres of cotton, peanuts, and grain. Reports described their precision and speed. The same qualities that once made the Wehrmacht formidable in battle were now feeding American soldiers overseas. And yet, something deeper happened. The very act of manual labor, planting, harvesting, building, humanized the war. It replaced propaganda with experience. The men who once fought for conquest were now participating, unwittingly, in America's agricultural victory. Every field plowed, every bale stacked, became a quiet symbol of transformation, from weapon to worker, from enemy to neighbor. Among the American officers who supervised the camps, a few understood the psychological weight of what was unfolding. They realized that discipline alone could not hold thousands of men behind wire. Only respect could. When the prisoners were first given limited freedom to operate tractors or trucks, it was an experiment in faith. Each morning, guards drove them out in convoys, dropped them at distant fields, and returned hours later. Not one failed to come back. Reports from Camp Swift noted, prisoners display remarkable reliability when entrusted with machinery or transport tasks. That reliability became contagious. The more freedom they were granted, the more responsibly they behaved. It was a feedback loop of dignity, one that reshaped their view of America and of themselves. Former POWs later admitted that this experience cracked the core of their indoctrination. One recalled, "It was strange. They gave us work, freedom, and trust. It made us question who the real barbarians were." The tractor, in that sense, became more than a machine. It was a symbol of moral leverage, a test of conscience, not loyalty. And it worked. The story, however, does not end with quiet cooperation. Because one day, that fragile experiment reached its most astonishing moment, when a group of prisoners was not only trusted to work alone, but to drive freely across open land. It was there, in the sun-scorched fields of central Texas, that a German gunner named Otto would grip the wheel of a tractor and, for the first time since capture, feel the strange pulse of freedom. For decades, wars had been fought not only with bullets, but with dehumanization. Every army was taught that the enemy was a monster, ruthless, beyond redemption. But in the quiet fields of Texas, that myth began to die. When a captured German was allowed to laugh, to plow, to fix a fence, he was no longer just a uniform. He became a man again. And when American civilians saw him smile or wave to their children, their image of the enemy changed too. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something subtler, recognition. The Geneva Convention had laid the legal foundation for humane treatment, but what unfolded in Texas went beyond law. It was moral experimentation, the idea that you could dismantle hate through ordinary kindness. In 1944, a Red Cross inspector wrote in astonishment, "I have visited POW camps across the world. Nowhere have I seen captives treated with such civility, and nowhere have I seen captors so unafraid of it." The true power of the American system lay not in the guards, the fences, or the rules, but in restraint. The refusal to mirror cruelty became its own form of strength. Each handshake across barbed wire was a quiet victory of character over vengeance. At the same time, this experiment tested America's own identity. Newspapers carried occasional headlines about enemy labor being used in rural industries. Some readers were furious. Families with sons fighting in Europe questioned how their enemies could be working free in the American heartland. "My boy faces German guns," one mother wrote, "and the men behind them are driving our tractors?" The War Department's reply was pragmatic. They are contributing to the war effort through labor. But under that logic ran something deeper, a cultural statement. America would not descend into the same hatred it fought to destroy. This principle was not universally popular. Yet for many Texans, proximity softened prejudice. Farmers who once despised the Krauts began defending them against suspicion. Some even lobbied for leniency when repatriation began. Decades later, when historians interviewed local families, they found photographs, Germans standing proudly beside harvest wagons, smiling children perched on tractor hoods. Many of those images had been kept quietly for years, as if preserving a secret America had briefly revealed to itself. It was proof that democracy's greatest weapon was not just firepower, but fairness. Unknowingly, the POWs of Texas became part of a much larger narrative. When the war ended in 1945, over 400,000 German prisoners had lived and worked on American soil. Many returned home stunned, not by defeat, but by what they had seen. A society that treated them better than their own regime had treated civilians. Their letters to families carried a message that would quietly influence post-war Germany. The Americans are not what we were told. Sociologists later traced subtle cultural effects from this experience. German towns where returning POWs had lived often became early centers of democratic reform. They had glimpsed a functioning system based on trust, law, and shared responsibility, not fear. In a sense, the plowed fields of Texas were an unseen front of the war, one that prepared the ground for reconciliation long before peace treaties were signed. The same men who once served under swastikas would later help rebuild their country under a different flag, carrying lessons learned not from propaganda, but from a farmer's handshake. As 1945 approached, the war's tide was turning. News of Germany's collapse filtered into the camps. Rumors spread of surrender, of return, of uncertainty. Yet amid that chaos, one image endured: the sight of German prisoners steering tractors across golden fields, laughing under the Texas sun. Their laughter, faint and human, would become one of the strangest echoes of World War II. 2. Central Texas. Early spring, 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but inside Camp Hearn, the German prisoners still followed the same routine. Breakfast at dawn, roll call, work assignments, transport to local farms. One of those prisoners was a 26-year-old artillery gunner named Otto Keller, captured in Normandy the previous summer. Blonde, quiet, and disciplined, Otto had served under Rommel's command before being wounded and captured near St. Lo. He had spent months working on a Texas farm owned by Henry McCall, a fourth-generation cotton grower whose two sons were serving in the Pacific. McCall was cautious at first. He treated the POWs like tools, not men. But Otto's precision, his punctuality, his calm competence with machines slowly changed that. By April, McCall had begun trusting him with light repairs and solo tasks. He noticed how Otto inspected every gear, every oil seal, how he never wasted a drop of fuel. "He runs that tractor like it's a Panzer," McCall once joked to a neighbor. That morning, the camp truck dropped off 6 prisoners at McCall's property as usual. But a storm had washed out the lower fields. The guards were delayed, and McCall was short on men. Standing near the barn, he pointed to the far ridge, a mile away. "Otto, take the tractor. We need that east field turned before sundown." The other POWs exchanged nervous glances. That ridge was outside the usual perimeter, beyond sight of the farmhouse, near the road that led toward town. For a moment, Otto froze. He looked at McCall as if to confirm what he'd heard. McCall simply nodded. "Go on. You know the way." Otto climbed into the tractor seat, still half in disbelief. The machine's green paint gleamed under the morning sun. He pressed the clutch, eased the throttle, and the engine roared to life. He drove slowly at first, dust rising behind him. The open land stretched endlessly. No fences, no watchtowers, just a thin horizon of mesquite and wheat. For the first time since capture, he was utterly unguarded. The war that had consumed his life was thousands of miles away, collapsing into ruins. Yet here he was, driving an American machine through American soil, trusted completely by the man whose nation had captured him. Halfway across the field, Otto stopped the tractor and turned off the engine. The silence was enormous. He could hear only the wind and the faint hum of insects. To his left, the county road shimmered in the distance. The way to freedom. He could have walked there. He could have vanished. Every instinct trained by war told him to seize the chance. But something stopped him. Something heavier than fear, stronger than loyalty. He sat in that silence for a long time, staring at the empty road, before turning the key again. The engine sputtered back to life. He steered the tractor toward the far ridge and began to plow. Hours later, McCall looked out from the porch and saw the distant dust plume moving in perfect lines. Steady, rhythmic, exact. Otto was still there. When the guards arrived at dusk, Otto climbed down, wiped the grease from his hands, and waited for the truck. McCall walked up, said nothing, and handed him a canteen. "Good work," the farmer said simply. Otto nodded. "Danke, sir." That evening, word spread quietly through the camp. A German POW had been trusted to drive a tractor beyond sight, and he had returned. The story rippled through the barracks, igniting whispered conversations. For some, it was a small miracle. For others, a lesson. One prisoner wrote in his diary that night, "The Americans do not understand what they are doing. This kind of trust is dangerous, because it makes us wish we were like them." That single day became legend in Camp Hearn. Officers noted the incident in reports, but took no disciplinary action. They saw it as proof that their program was working, that dignity could control men more effectively than force. And though Otto never spoke much about it, the experience changed him. He would later tell an interviewer in 1972, "When that man let me go alone, I realized I was no longer a prisoner. I was responsible for myself again." The image of him steering that tractor under the vast Texas sky became a quiet symbol, not of defiance, but of transformation. It was a moment when victory ceased to mean domination and began to mean understanding. But not all stories of trust ended so gently. As the war drew to its end and the camps prepared for repatriation, new tensions began to surface. Between soldiers longing for home, civilians fearing retribution, and a nation uncertain what to do with thousands of enemy workers it had learned to respect. And in those final weeks, the fragile bridge between captor and captive would face its hardest test yet. By the spring of 1945, the mood inside America's POW camps had changed. The radios in the guard towers carried rumors of Berlin under siege. Camp officers began receiving new orders. Prepare for repatriation. For the Germans in Texas, it was a strange kind of dread. They had dreamed for years of going home. Yet when that moment came, many no longer wanted to leave. Camp Hearn's internal reports noted a striking pattern. Morale dropped, discipline wavered, and fights broke out among factions. Some prisoners, still loyal to Hitler, accused others of going soft. Others feared that returning to Germany meant starvation or Soviet captivity. And for men like Otto Keller, the thought of leaving Texas, of leaving freedom disguised as captivity, felt like exile, letters, goodbyes, and the weight of change. In May, as news of Germany's surrender broke, American guards lowered the volume on their radios out of respect. Some prisoners wept quietly. Others stood expressionless, hands folded behind their backs. At Camp Hearn, the final roll calls began. Trains were scheduled to carry the POWs to ports in New York and New Orleans. From there, ships would take them to Europe, many not yet knowing whether they'd end up in British, French, or Soviet zones. Farmers who had relied on their labor gathered to say goodbye. McCall was one of them. When Otto stepped down from the truck one last time, McCall extended his hand. "You did good work here, son," he said softly. Otto hesitated, then shook his hand. "I will not forget this place," he replied in halting English. For a brief moment, they stood there, two men who had begun the war on opposite sides of a gun barrel, now bound by something quieter and more lasting. McCall reached into his pocket and handed Otto a small photograph, a snapshot taken weeks earlier of the field they had plowed together. On the back, a note in pencil read, "So you remember Texas." Otto folded it carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. The trains of return in. June 1945. The first repatriation trains began moving east. At every stop, local crowds gathered. Some curious, some hostile. Yet the prisoners carried themselves differently now. They wore American-issued clothes, their uniforms long gone. Some even carried English books or small gifts from the families they'd worked for. For Otto, The journey north felt like watching his own transformation in reverse, from worker to captive, from human to number. He later wrote, "They treated us not as enemies, but as men. And because of that, I no longer wish to fight anyone." On the platform at Camp Swift, an American sergeant who had guarded the prisoners from the start stood watching the final train depart. "They were the best men I ever had to guard," he told a journalist. Not one tried to escape. Maybe they had nowhere better to go. A quiet legacy in the fields back in Texas. Summer returned. The tractors kept running, the crops grew tall, and the war felt distant again. Yet for many farmers, something lingered. Some continued writing letters to their former POW workers. Others sent small care packages, tobacco, shirts, spare tools, through Red Cross channels. A few even traveled to Germany years later, visiting the men who had once worked their land. One of those letters reached Otto in 1947, now living in a ruined town near Kassel. It was from McCall. The letter was short. "Cotton's good this year. I still got your picture in the shed. Hope you're doing fine." Otto never replied. Mail was unreliable, but he kept that letter for the rest of his life. When he died in 1993, his daughter found it tucked inside an old photo album beside the worn photograph of the Texas field. On the back of the photo, he had written one final note: "The place where I stopped being a soldier." That phrase, though simple, captured what thousands of German POWs had experienced in America, a kind of moral disarmament. They came as enemies. They left as men who had seen another way of life, one that proved strength could come from restraint, and that trust could outlast war itself. As ships carried the last prisoners home, American officers filed their closing reports. One colonel in charge of the Texas camps wrote, "We discovered that humanity is a far better guard than barbed wire." It was an insight that would ripple through history, quietly but enduringly, shaping how future nations would treat their captured foes. From that moment, the war's human front was never the same, because deep in the heart of Texas, a handful of farmers and former soldiers had proven something the world rarely learns in time: that even in war, compassion can become its own victory. When the guns fell silent in Europe, more than 370,000 German POWs remained on American soil. Of those, nearly 80,000 had lived and worked across Texas, in camps stretching from Camp Hearn and Camp Swift to small satellite units, scattered across cotton towns and ranch lands. Their departure in 1945 marked the end of one of the most unusual wartime experiments in history, a system that had combined military necessity with moral conviction. Official U.S. Army evaluations of the POW labor program described its results as beyond expectation. Productivity had exceeded projections, and incidents of violence or escape attempts were astonishingly rare. Across all Texas facilities, escape attempts accounted for less than 0.02% of the population, most of them symbolic, not serious, but numbers tell only part of the story. Inspectors from the International Red Cross consistently reported that the camps upheld and often exceeded Geneva Convention standards. POWs received mail, educational opportunities, even classes in English, mathematics, and history. Some participated in cultural groups, choirs, theater performances, even small newspapers printed within the camps. American administrators called it re-education through example. Rather than lectures on democracy, they allowed prisoners to live inside it, to see fairness enforced by practice, not propaganda. The effect of this humane approach was profound and long-lasting. In 1946, sociologists from the Office of War Information interviewed returning POWs across occupied Germany. Their findings were unexpected. A significant number expressed admiration for American order, fairness, and discipline. One respondent put it simply: they never needed to shout. That was their power. This subtle moral victory became one of the earliest psychological successes of the Allied post-war effort. It demonstrated that behavior, not ideology, could dismantle totalitarian thinking. In regions of Germany where large numbers of repatriated POWs had lived in U.S. camps, researchers noted measurable changes in civic behavior, increased participation in local elections, reduced support for extremist parties, and stronger adherence to democratic processes. What had begun as a wartime labor solution had evolved into an unplanned instrument of reconstruction. For the United States, too, the program left an internal legacy. It tested the nation's ability to hold moral ground under extreme pressure. The decision to treat enemy prisoners with dignity while American soldiers were dying overseas was controversial, and yet, in hindsight, it became one of the country's quiet triumphs. The War Department's closing memorandum on the POW system concluded, "Discipline maintained by fairness is stronger than that maintained by fear." This philosophy later influenced the formation of U.S. Army Field Manual 27-10, which codified humane treatment and lawful conduct toward prisoners, principles that guided military behavior in conflicts for decades to come. The moral calculus was simple but revolutionary. Mercy was not weakness, it was strategy. And across Texas, traces of that experiment remained long after the camps were dismantled. Farmers reused the lumber from barracks to build barns. Old watchtowers became grain silos. In some rural cemeteries, small granite markers still bear German names. Men who never made it home, buried not as enemies, but as neighbors. Their graves stand quietly among the mesquite and wildflowers, reminders that the line between captor and captive had once blurred in the bright, forgiving sun of Texas. Yet the story was not over, because what happened next, as post-war Germany rebuilt itself from the ruins, proved how deeply those seeds of humanity had taken root. The very men who had once driven tractors under the Lone Star sky would soon find themselves rebuilding towns, teaching civic order, and redefining what it meant to be German. When the transport ships departed Galveston in 1946, the German prisoners carried more than duffel bags. They carried notebooks filled with English phrases, photographs of Texas sunsets, and a mental picture of a world that functioned without fear. The U.S. government had arranged the repatriation under Operation Swallow, sending tens of thousands of POWs back through Le Havre, Cherbourg, and Bremerhaven. Most were returned in groups based on the regions they came from, Bavaria, Hesse, Prussia, so they could assist in local reconstruction. But what unfolded in the following years took even Allied planners by surprise. Many former Texas POWs became informal ambassadors of democratic behavior. They volunteered for town councils, police units, and agricultural boards in the newly reconstituted Federal Republic of Germany. Sociologist Edward Peterson later documented in his 1955 report, Re-Education in Captivity, that ex-prisoners who had lived in American camps showed significantly higher acceptance of democratic norms than those held in Soviet or even British custody. In interviews, some recalled their first civic lessons not from classrooms, but from watching how Texans settled disputes, calmly, often with a handshake instead of a shout. It was the first time I saw authority and kindness in the same uniform, remembered former POW Friedrich Menke, who later became a mayor in Lower Saxony. By the 1950s, these returnees had become a quiet force in shaping West Germany's post-war identity. They helped organize local cooperatives, modeled after the community structures they had seen in rural America. Some even introduced mechanical techniques they learned on Texas farms, crop rotation, irrigation scheduling, and the efficient use of tractors that once astonished them as prisoners. When American officials later arrived under the Marshall Plan, they found a surprising readiness among these communities to work with them. Trust, rare in the early post-war years, already existed, built not by diplomats, but by the small courtesies exchanged in the fields of Texas. The moral success of that POW program became one of the unspoken foundations of the transatlantic alliance. It had proven that respect could outlast propaganda, that empathy could be a stronger diplomatic weapon than fear. Back in Texas, the memory of those prisoners never entirely faded. Some families kept the hand-carved gifts the Germans had made, wooden boxes, miniature windmills, or engraved belt buckles. Local newspapers occasionally printed letters from Germany, written in careful English. "We thank you for the bread and for showing us what fairness is." Former camp guards and farmers often described their feelings with one word: strange. They had gone to war expecting to hate, yet found themselves teaching, laughing, sometimes mourning, alongside their enemies. In 1990, decades after the war, a group of German veterans returned to Texas to visit the sites of their captivity. The camps were gone, replaced by farmland and silence, but the men were greeted by descendants of the same farmers they once worked for. Together, they planted small oak trees to mark the old perimeters. One veteran, tears in his eyes, said softly, "We thought we were prisoners, but we were being set free from something inside us." By the time the Cold War began, both nations had long moved on. Yet the lesson of the Texas camps lived quietly within military handbooks, humanitarian law, and the invisible architecture of post-war peace, the idea that moral conduct could be strategically effective, that dignity could transform enemies into allies, became a cornerstone of modern U.S. military ethics. In Germany, the same idea evolved into a civic principle: Stärke durch Anstand, strength through decency. It was a saying born not from battlefields, but from cotton rows and tractor seats beneath a Texas sun. And so, what began as a temporary wartime labor arrangement ended as one of the most quietly transformative encounters in modern history. A meeting of opposites that proved humanity itself could be a weapon of victory. History often remembers battles in terms of blood and territory. Generals, guns, and strategic maps dominate the narrative. Yet sometimes, the most profound victories are quieter, almost invisible. The Texas POW camps of World War II were not sites of combat or heroics in the traditional sense, but they became arenas of human transformation. Through simple acts, sharing a meal, showing a prisoner how to drive a tractor, treating an enemy with respect, the farmers of Texas reshaped lives. They demonstrated that empathy, consistency, and fairness could penetrate even the hardest hearts, leaving lasting impressions far beyond the confines of barbed wire. What these soldiers experienced was not a lesson in war, but in civilization itself. The returned German prisoners carried these lessons home, influencing the moral reconstruction of their nation. They became conduits of democratic principles, bearers of cross-cultural understanding, and, in some cases, leaders who quietly shaped the fabric of post-war Germany. A chance encounter in a field could ripple across continents, altering communities, policies, and perceptions in ways that military campaigns never could. Ultimately, the story reminds us that war does not solely define humanity. Our response to it does. In a world consumed by strategy and survival, the small, deliberate choices to honor dignity over enmity, curiosity over suspicion, and cooperation over coercion can be revolutionary. The tractors, the cotton fields, and the laughter shared between former enemies were instruments of peace as potent as any treaty or political accord. The Texas farms became a bridge, a rare testament to the enduring power of respect, even amidst conflict. And while history often glorifies the noise of guns and the roar of engines, it is in the quiet moments, beneath the open sky and the hum of a tractor, that the truest lessons of humanity are sometimes learned.